So there's something that's kind of simultaneously scary, amazing, and boring, or leading to boredom. And that thing is the amazing ability that we have to adapt to our circumstances. So, you know how, this is something I think that we run into as kids. And it has to do with getting used to whatever the new thing is. So, you get a new toy and you're like, oh, this is so fantastic. Or before you get the toy, especially, you're like, man, if I could have that toy, oh my goodness, that would be amazing. I would be like happy for the rest of my life. And then you get the toy and you're like, oh, this is so fun. And then about an hour into it or half an hour into it or something, you're like, okay, this is pretty fun. And the next day, it's still kind of fun. And then by the third day, you're like, maybe I'll do something else, right? um, and and so we have this amazing ability to kind of adapt and kind of stay at our baseline, if you will. So kind of our baseline emotion. And I think they've documented this, that most people tend to stay about the same level of happy throughout their life. Now, there are ebbs and flows, and for sure, some people, have like depression or have elation or whatever. But on the whole, they say, as I recall, they say that you tend to have about the same level of happiness throughout your life. And so there's a very sort of emotional adaptability to where like you very so that's like kind of a good thing and a bad thing, right? So you think about something terrible happening. The good news is, after the terrible thing happens, after some time, you'll probably be kind of back to where you were before. The bad news is that when something really awesome happens over time, you're gonna tend to end up kind of back to where you were before on an emotional level. So it's kind of good news, bad news type situation. And it also does give us some clues as to why we might want variety in our life and why we might tend to be bored. Is because our brains are wired to notice new things, I would say. Okay, so it's not efficient for us to be noticing all the time the same thing over and over. So if I always walk past, let's say I always drive past the same store on the way to work, it does me no good essentially to notice that store. Like, that's why would I need to notice that store? My brain is like, that thing is always there, no need to notice it. And so the next 10 times I drive past, I don't even really see it. Like, it's maybe it came into my visual sphere, but I didn't actually see it, right? There's this one stoplight on the way home from work that I need to be a little bit careful about, and at one time I kind of ran it, actually. And I was very blessed that somebody saw me and we didn't have any accident, but it was too close for comfort. And so it kind of raises questions around, okay, getting distracted here by something new in my environment here. But it is interesting, and I think about this some in my relationship with God, in our church life, in my marriage. There are so many benefits to doing something over a sustained period of time when you're trying to build something or grow something or just have a good life, a good solid life. And how does one go about keeping the sort of excitement or the sort of intensity that sustains action? So in other words, how do I keep, like, how do you not fall out of love? Like, how do you stay in love with God, with your spouse, with your job, when these things often stay relatively, I mean, God especially, like, if you want to talk about something that doesn't change, like, God is a person who explicitly does not change. Now there's some nuance to explore there, but very explicitly the Bible says that he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so it's like, well, how do you go about keeping your brain interested in God when he doesn't change. Now, our lives do change, and we get to experience new aspects of God as our life changes. But it is an interesting question. And then also, the other side of this, too, is that we also get used to things that are subpar. So if I have a behavioral pattern that is not good, so let's make this practical. Let's say, one of mine is I get up later in the mornings than what I could. But if I do that every morning and get less work done every day, I become used to it. I don't necessarily, now as you can tell, I apparently I still do think about it because I brought it up, but depending on how acclimated I was to an attitude, to a behavior that I had, even if it wasn't a good one, I would still be, I would think it was normal. I wouldn't even think about it probably because it's default for me. It can also be the same as an environment. Like you can allow, lousy entertainment or whatever, or toxic people, if you will, into your environment. And over time, like maybe at first it's like jarring. It's like, oh, wow, this person grates on me. And over time, maybe you just kind of get used to it. It's like, and you just get used to, like, let's say you have a person at work who's always whining about things. And maybe at first you were like, wow, this person needs a better outlook on life. This person is not very positive. But over time, you're like, maybe you kind of get used to it. And then next, maybe you start kind of doing some whining of your own. And we have the potential to get used to and acclimated to things that are not good. And so I just find this idea of norms to be interesting because I think they're so powerful. Like these things tend to come into, wow, I'm over 7 minutes now. This is really long for me here. But think about when if you've ever been to like a different culture, especially if you spend any significant time there, like let's say a month or more, is what I'm going to call significant. So longer than just like pop in as a tourist, but even that, but longer especially, to where you start living some real life there and meeting people and starting to really bump into like attitudes and underlying assumptions in their culture. You find that things that you never questioned in the slightest in your own culture, now you find are very odd or out of place in their culture, basically. And it raises questions that you maybe could not even have thought to raise because there was no trigger for you to see as anything except normal in the environment that you came from. It was only once you changed environments that you were able to question the normalness of the thing that you used to always do. For instance, we lived in Thailand in a village, and for the first several months we lived with a woman and several of her kids in a partial bamboo and concrete tin type of deal house, and we basically ate whatever they cooked. Now we also went and did some other shopping and got some stuff that we liked, but breakfast for them was often whatever was left over from the night before, maybe, or maybe they'd cook something fresh. But in America we have breakfast foods. In their culture, they didn't necessarily have it was all just food. It didn't really matter if it was breakfast or dinner, you just ate it. And whereas in America, we have this thing about there are certain foods that you eat for breakfast and certain foods that you do not eat for breakfast. You can eat pork for breakfast, but that is basically the only meat in America that you can eat for breakfast, unless you do like chicken and waffles, right? But for the most part, pork is the only meat you can eat for breakfast. That's the only breakfast food meat. Of course, eggs are acceptable, and then of course a lot of sweet things are acceptable as breakfast foods. So, living here in America, I didn't stop to question my choice of breakfast, I guess. It wasn't like I don't know that I would sit down to my bowl of cereal in the morning and be like, huh, why am I doing this? Why am I not having a hamburger right now? Like that wasn't even a thing, But when you go to these other cultures, then suddenly you realize this thing that didn't even like register on your consciousness because it was baked into your defaults. That thing is not the same everywhere, and it's kind of fascinating to think about our own attitudes towards life, our reactions to things, how we respond, our habits. I don't think that any of us have probably the mental and emotional bandwidth to constantly examine all of these things. I don't think we should try to necessarily. But it is interesting to think about the fact, and I think Myron Golden would claim that your success, as he defines it or whatever, but basically is determined by your defaults. It's by your programming, like so it is interesting to think about how much of life is influenced, determined, so on, by things I don't even think about. So think about my interactions with clients, the amount of time I spend at work, my interactions with a potential new client, things that I may or may not give much thought to could dramatically determine the course of my or the outcomes. I have a friend, and he always makes more money than I do and always charges more than I do. To this point, right? I'm not going to speak that into the future, but I'm saying to this point, this is what I've observed. And it's not necessarily that what he offers is more valuable. In fact, I would argue probably it's less valuable to many clients. But that's purely a point of opinion. But we kind of joke about it because, okay, so in case he watches this video, I'm going to slightly walk back what I just said about being less valuable. That may be incorrect. Okay, this is from my opinion. Obviously, we're going to do what we think is valuable for people, right? So he does what he thinks is valuable. I do what I think is valuable for people. But it's almost a joke now about how much he charges his clients for services that he offers, because his prices are very, very substantial. And is he a lot smarter than I am? I don't think so. I think our intelligence level is pretty similar. I think he's more, his personality is different and his communication skills are different. I think he's got a way of, I think he's probably better at sales, and I think he has a more confident aura that he carries with him. And he's great at networking. He's always meeting people and making deals and stuff. And so it's just interesting, some of his kind of built-in strengths, some of his defaults, some of the things he naturally does well. And some of his perspectives and views, he makes more money than I do. And it's not necessarily based purely on value. It's not necessarily based purely on intelligence. There's other things going on, at least some other things going on, that have a big impact on his outcomes. So, pretty interesting stuff. Anyway, 13 minutes and 50 seconds. That's enough rambling for today. Thank you for watching.